Well, you might remember a few weeks ago, all eyes were on the Pacific, with China's foreign minister and our own touring the region, separately I might add. China was seeking to confirm a sweeping trade and security deal with 10 Pacific countries, but they fell short of reaching that consensus. Much of the reporting at the time was focused on winning over individual island states, but relations in the Pacific are far more nuanced than that. In recent years, the term Blue Pacific has been used by Pacific Island nations to describe the region. It's intended to shift the thinking about the region from that of small, poor, vulnerable island states to one of large ocean states. The Blue Pacific is a recognition that the ocean is the primary influence in the Pacific's way of life, shaping history, values and culture. Tarcisius Kabutaulaka is an associate professor at the University of Hawaiʻi Centre for Pacific Studies in Honolulu. He's written extensively about the Blue Pacific and he joins us now. Tarcisius, thank you for staying up late to come on the program. Very big welcome to you.
Thank you so much, Hamu. Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about this Blue Pacific idea. I noted that sort of at the genesis of it, the idea was that the Pacific couldn't keep relying on the goodwill of big nations that had left them vulnerable, particularly in relation to climate change. So how did this idea of the Blue Pacific come up?
It actually has a long history. I think the discussions were taking place beyond the policy discussions, particularly in academia, where there were concerns about how the Pacific Islands region was framed and understood, that a lot of the discussions of the Pacific tend to be focused on what would be described as deficit discourse, on what the Pacific doesn't have. It doesn't have big land areas. It doesn't have big economies. And so a lot of the focus was on the vulnerabilities of the Pacific. And there were people like Epeli Hauofa who were saying that, hold on, we can understand the Pacific in a different way. We can understand the Pacific as a large ocean state or large ocean states, that the Pacific Ocean doesn't disconnect us, it connects us. People from Hawaii all the way down to Aotearoa, to Australia, to Papua New Guinea, that this is our highway that connects the different Pacific places. And therefore, if you look at it in that sense, the Pacific is huge. It covers a third of our planet's surface area. It is our huge, biggest carbon sink. It has a lot of resources. 60% of global tuna comes from the Pacific. And so a shift away from the negative representation of the Pacific into a positive one, and therefore making it significant to the globe. And so in that sense, it was a way of changing narratives about the region. But taking that narrative and then saying, how do we use it in our relationship with the globe, with other people?
When you think about it, so it comes out of this lovely narrative about who we are in the Pacific, from academics and writers, and then it comes into diplomacy. And when it arrives with the diplomats and it comes into the DNA then of the diplomacy of the Pacific, what we see it mean is collective decision making. So when the Chinese came knocking, Beijing, remember in Fiji, everyone went, oh, well, they'll roll over for Beijing's influence and money. They said, no, we can't come to a consensus, so we'll pass, thank you. What? We said, what happened? No, it's collective, and climate change is at the centre of it. So it's a powerful, assertive, diplomatic position that the Pacific has formulated.
Important to Pacific Island countries. And we've seen it work in the past. And examples of where it has worked are things like the anti-nuclear treaty, the Rarotonga Treaty, the tuna agreement with the US, and push for decolonization in the region. And very early on, Pacific Island countries realized that in order to be successful in global arenas, in global forums, it is important that they work as a group together rather than as individual countries. And so when China, for instance, attempts to have a multilateral agreement. It means trying to get all these countries to have a consensus on an issue. And despite the bilateral agreements that China signed between the different Pacific Island countries, the multilateral agreement has to have this collective diplomatic agreement between all the Pacific Island countries.
Imelda, this is a powerful idea. And when Tarcisius writes about it, he calls it countermapping. And he describes that if Beijing looks down at the Pacific, they see the Belt and Road and the new maritime, Silk Road. And when America looks at the Pacific, they look over San Diego, past where Tarcisius is in Honolulu, and they stretch over to the because they want to muscle the Chinese. And when Australia looks at the Pacific, if we look over our right shoulder, Imelda, we might just see in our backyard, that's how we think of it, right? And we look over our left shoulder and we just see the tippy top of Aotearoa, North Island, New Zealand. But how do you see the Pacific?
I see the Pacific as oldest living governance structures, cultures, and that's what Blue Pacific represents, is our ancestry. And we've got to remember, Australia is a Black Australia. It's a First Nations country with governance systems in place long before colonisation. Pacific region, oldest living Indigenous cultures. And then it's coupled with colonialism that's imposed this governance structure that isn't working. So what I say to America is to retract and deal with their First Nations issues and build capacity through that relationship. And other interested countries for the Pacific is about extending some sort of humility in how they engage with us. Because you've got to remember, we were here long before colonialism. So really what's happening is that it's not working. Climate change is real. The impacts of colonisation have caused the challenges that we're seeing today across Australia. You've got islands in Vanuatu, in particular the Banks, in 2008, an entire island sunk, having to relocate 500 residents. Nobody hears about that, but now our voice is being heard. The Torres Strait is also facing severe high sea level rise, begging for support from government, but the climate is speaking on behalf of us. That one soul wara, we need to take note and respect that governance structure and the people that represent that one soul wara.
Tarcisius, is it too crude to say that another part of the success of this Blue Pacific narrative is the fact that the major parties are squabbling over the Pacific? That Australia has, I wrote it all down from your article, Australia's got what have we got? A Pacific step up, and New Zealand's got a Pacific reset. Yeah, Indonesia's got a Pacific evaluation. The USA has a Pacific pledge. Britain has a Pacific tilt. And that suddenly in the Pacific, is it too crude to say that Pacific Island leaders have leverage? They can play these guys off against each other for what they want, which is action on climate.
So if we were to step back a little bit and look at how, what we've seen since the 1800s and even before that is people mapping their interests onto different parts of the world, and particularly the countries of Western Europe and a very small part of Western Europe that have gone around the world and mapped their interests. And so cartography is very important to colonialism. So with the explorers that travel around the world, there are always map makers, because cartography is powerful. If you can map a place, you therefore can claim it and therefore give visibility to it to the people from where you came. And so we've seen that in the case of the Pacific. The countries that we know today as Fiji or Vanuatu or Solomon Islands, those were colonial products. Those were places that were produced as a result of colonial cartography and then became nation states. And those nation states assume a disconnection between the different countries. Now, what we've seen in recent years is the mapping of geopolitical interest. So we've seen the place described as Asia Pacific. And the Asia Pacific focuses mostly on the rim. And the Pacific region within the Pacific is often seen as what some scholars have described as a hole in the donut, that it is insignificant. What we've seen more recently is this term Indo-Pacific, in which the US, in one utterance, lays claim to a region that covers two huge oceans, the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and everything in between. That is their sphere of geopolitical influence. And the assumption is that it is either empty within or that what exists within is insignificant and therefore can be claimed and mapped into one sphere of influence. Now, the Blue Pacific is Pacific Islanders pushing back on that and saying, hey, we can map our own interests in this place that for us is not only a place and a home, but a place to which we have responsibility. So we are not necessarily custodians of the Pacific Ocean, because custodianship implies having power over it. We have responsibility to it rather than custodianship. And out of that responsibility is the issue of climate change, that we have to ensure that this place is protected from climate change, which is regarded for Pacific Island countries as the most important existential threat that the region faces, not China, not the geopolitical threats that Australia and the US have talked about.
James, this is very much your area of specialty, First Nations foreign policy. I mean, traditional big power politics, whether in colonial times or modern times, is about divide and conquer. And what the Pacific is talking about is working collectively in consensus. Do you really think this Blue Pacific idea has the power to have influence in Beijing, Washington and Canberra and beyond in terms of how we deal with Pacific Island leaders and with the issues they want to talk about?
Yeah, look, I mean, I sure hope it would. I think it's the kind of thing that really reframes the narrative from the Pacific, and they're reclaiming their identity in the face of a long history of colonialism. I'm here right now on Radri Nurrumbungle, Radri country, on my country, surrounded by beautiful Radri Main, Radri people, Radri friends of mine, and I think that part of that identity, part of that reclaiming for us is asserting that identity, and reclaiming that narrative for ourselves. And so there's a strong parallel, I see at least, between the indigenous peoples of the Pacific and First Nations here, the oldest continuing culture in the world, in this reclaiming of the narrative and asserting our sovereignty and our rights and our responsibilities, because those two things go quite closely together. We have rights as citizens here, we have rights as peoples, we also have responsibilities to country, to animals, to the plants, to the land, and to all who live on it. And I think this kind of the Blue Pacific push really, to me, represents a great endeavour in that field to assert their own sovereignty and dominance and assert their culture as well. It's really important. Language is culture, is people, and these are strong Indigenous peoples throughout the Pacific, from Hawaii to Aotearoa to everywhere in between. And so I think to me it's a really important push. I hope governments like Australia, governments like the United States, governments like New Zealand and China really listen to it. But as Imelda did say, we really need to, in this country and the others, focus on our issues with Indigenous peoples in our own countries first, and then use that to reach out to our Pacific neighbours with a much more hopeful and a much more optimistic and open hand.
Trent.
Can I just add?
Yes, indeed, Amelia.
Oh, sorry.
You go.
I just want to remind everyone that Australia has, this year marks 175 years since the first Melanesian labourers were blackbirded to New South Wales in particular. Sydney was the epicentre for a blackbird trade that saw some 60,000 men reach from their island states to build this economy.
As slaves, let's be clear, as slaves.
As slaves, thank you so much, as slaves, but at the same time, we are still here. We are the descendants of that. And then there's a guesstimate 70-odd thousand Australian South Sea Islanders surviving today with that evident kinship with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And we're unpacking, we're truth-telling, we're decolonising, and don't underestimate, as I said the other week, Pacific nations have been holding up this economy right up until COVID, more recently, when you're seeing Vanuatu providing the largest seasonal worker trade in this country and picking our fruit. Some 7,000 to 8,000 out of the 11,000 that are here today, 2022, are from Vanuatu. So, you know, sustainable economies and all of this stuff about climate change, if we don't address climate change, we have nothing.
Okay.
And if you don't listen to the First Nations people of the region, we will soon have nothing.
Just a quick final comment, if you can, Tarcisius. How much ground has Australia got to make up in terms of understanding, truly understanding the Pacific in the way you've described it, and making up for the clashes over climate change and the hurt?
I can't pretend to tell Australia what to do because I'm not Australian, although that's where I was educated. But I can say for certain that there is room for greater understanding. And one area to begin is, you know, through cultural diplomacy with Indigenous Australians, Pacific Islanders who have been relocated to Australia. We've seen Australia's diplomacy dominated by the Australian state, and that's understandable given that diplomacies are usually carried out by states. But perhaps there's a room of creating relationships that go beyond states, working together with Indigenous Australians, Pacific Islander or South Sea Islander Australians. And there is an increasing population of diaspora Pacific Islanders in Australia who can play a part in the relationship between Australia and the Pacific. We've seen Aotearoa New Zealand done that, and part of the reason is that they have a huge Pacific Islander population, and of course our brothers and sisters who are of Maori Aotearoa. And so I think that's a place where we can explore.
Okay.
In terms of state-to-state relationship, there is space for more listening and genuine listening to Pacific Island countries and people on what is important to them, and then building on that. And I'm really confident that, you know, hopefully with the new government in Canberra, we will be able to do that. But as I said earlier, I cannot pretend to tell Australians what to do.
Professor, thank you so very much. It's been wonderful to meet you. Thank you so much for staying up late in Hawaii. You hail from the Solomon Islands. You did your PhD at the ANU, where James studies as well. So it's wonderful to have you as part of the Pacific family. Professor, thank you so very much for that. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and good night. Don't bongi.